Hello, everyone. Today is the 7th of December, and today we're going to game what the Fed might do and why, and what the market reaction might be. I know it's not next week, but next week we do have CPI and PPI, and those are really the only missing pieces of the puzzle before the FOMC sits down and decides what they're going to do in December. And we're going to try and get there and see what the compromise at the FOMC might be and what the market reaction might be. First of all, what happened last week, Andy? Nothing really that would tell us that the economy is doing anything but what it has been doing for months, i.e., chugging along at a very high pace without any real signs that it's going to moderate anytime soon.
Yeah. GDP now printed 3.3% this by the end of the week. The jobs number, there's always something to look at that's negative. And, we're starting to get a little bit concerned about things like the absolute size of the labor force not basically flatlining, which, is newish, but not unexpected given how the economy is progressing. And that gave the bond market a bit of a bid. That's been basically a bit of a bid since the Treasury Secretary was announced, and that continued this week. But, when you step back and look at the macroeconomy, it just doesn't look like it's about to roll over.
Yeah, certainly. And really, the inflation picture is muted, right? I mean, it's neither accelerating nor decelerating. It just seems to be at this 2.5% to 3%, basically above where the Fed would like it. But I don't think do you see any signs that it's accelerating? Because I certainly don't see any signs that it's decelerating.
Right. Again, my view, I think our view has been pretty consistent that the inflation is not going back to target, and it's staying sticky at a level that is too high for the Fed. And, each data point we're going to get is going to be an inflation amount that is between 0.2, which is too high for the Fed, and 0.3, which is what the expectations are for this particular print, which is well too high to the Fed, because if you annualize 0.2, you get 2.4-ish. You have to compound it. And if you annualize 0.3, you get 3.6-ish. And those are above target. And so for us to get inflation back down to target requires just consistent 0.1 and 0.2 inflation months. And there's no sign of that.
Yeah. So what would you do? I mean, I know what you would do, but what do you think is reasonable to expect that the Fed does?
Right. So let's start first with pricing. And the market is, the last I looked, it was 87% chance that they're going to cut in 2 weeks. And so one would have to say, well, why wouldn't that be right? The market's pricing that. My view is that the employment number gave them it wasn't so hot that it was warm, wasn't so hot that it would mean a pause immediately. And since then, and all week, the Fed speakers have said, yeah, we're leaning toward cut, or we're likely to cut, but not likely. We're leaning toward cuts. There's more work to be done. Both rates are still restrictive, so we do want to bring policy rates down. But, a larger group is beginning to re-emphasize how they are very patient. And so there are enough people out there that are saying, enough voters at the Fed saying pause, that, I don't know. To me, if as a betting man, if I were to say 87% is priced as the odds, I think it's less than 87%, but not greater than 50%, but greater than 50%. The odds are they're going to cut. And so the question becomes next week, as we look at the CPI and PPI, which are the big data points of next week, will they be hot enough to cause the market to price out all of the cut. And it's unlikely that it'd be hot enough, but obviously that'd be relevant if it were. So I think going into the FOMC, you're going to be at greater than 50% chance of cut. And that means that they are going to likely cut.
You're right. I mean, there are so many excuses for a cut. You could point to oil prices down at the lows for the year. You can point to commodity prices having gone up not at all this year on index basis, as it were, whether you look at the Goldman Sachs index or the Bloomberg index for commodities, they are basically unchanged for the year. So you can start saying that where is the inflationary pressure coming from? Well, it's coming from retail sales, isn't it? It's coming from people being flush with cash and buying lots of stuff. So maybe commodities don't matter that much, but they're a useful excuse for the doves, and they can point to that. So let's try and game what the market reactions would be on a cut or no cut. And really, I feel, and I don't know how you feel, that it's all going to be in the presser afterwards rather than the announcement of a cut or a pause. It all depends what they want to do afterwards. I don't think the market really much cares whether the cut is in December or in January. What it cares about is what the dot plots are going to say about what they feel comes next.
Right. And the dot plots are I think, very useful set of information if you look more deeply into that regarding the consensus versus the extremes. And what you notice if you look at the paths of the dot plot for the last few months, last year, and also corroborate it with the statements of each of the members, there's a pretty meaningful divide on the committee in which there are roughly 7, maybe 6 hawks who think that rates should not be cut. And there are 6 lifelong dovish, never going to be anything but doves out there who think that, rates are way too high. And then there are the people that make the decisions that sit in the middle of that. Maybe it's 4 of them. And so when you look at a dot plot, you're just getting the median of that thing. And so that does influence those people. And so the dot plot is likely to move a little bit more hawkish, but not as hawkish as the current market. And so to me, while I'm going to pay a lot of attention to the dot plot, it's really the way Powell decides to frame the dot plot. And I'd like to know what you think the possibilities are in a cut scenario with the dot plots, rising like you might expect, and in the unlikely event of a pause scenario.
Okay. Well, let's first analyze what might be a decent compromise between the people you call the hawks and the doves. How about the market is already pricing in, as you said, 87% probability of a cut. The Fed hates to disappoint the market. It only does it when it wants to really send a message. And okay, so the compromise might be fine, let's cut, but also during the presser and via the SEP dot plots, tell them that that's it. We are now going to pause until the data tells us that we need to move one way or the other. And we won't move without the data, i.e., we think that we are close enough to neutral that we don't have to do very much more until the data says that we need to jump one way or another.
Right. So what that means is the way I think about that is that sort of I like the idea of the compromise. That sort of takes what had been when this cutting cycle started or began to be thought about even before it actually happened, that the cutting cycle would be 225 basis points fairly rapidly. Two, the cutting cycle may be over.
Right.
Yeah.
Data dependent, of
Right.
course, but they really need to stress this data dependency because they've used that word and it's become meaningless now because they keep
Right.
on cutting even though the data does not tell them to cut.
Right. I think
So,
that's important to say as it relates to the SEP. The September SEP that validated 100 basis points of cuts, which if for them to deliver, would be another cut, a 25 cut in December, had GDP at 2%. It's running at 3. Had PCE inflation, core PCE inflation at 2.6. It's running at 3. Had unemployment rate at 4.4. It's running at 4.25. And yet they're still cutting. It means the whole data dependency is being co-opted by an agenda to get rates down quickly.
right. They would really need to convince the market that, they are truly data dependent from now on. And that can only be done through the dot plots, but also through a very, very hawkish presser. Powell would really have to stress certain words and repeat them very often for the market to get the message.
Right. So
What?
ironically, right. The natural thing is, if for the market to believe, is if they cut in December, no matter what they say, they're cutting in January. That would be the natural reaction.
And that is what he would have to push back very, very hard against.
Right. So
You
the
know,
question I have about that, which I agree, anything that is a cut is going to create, um, extrapolate to further cuts, and he would have to push back hard. At the same time, for the first time, we're going into an FOMC meeting in which the dot plot and even this pushback that we're describing is already in the 2-year note.
yeah. Well, some of it is. Let's have a look at what the market reaction would be from the bond side and try to then have a look at what would happen to equities. You would, for the first time in a long, long time, you would actually have positive carry at the long end because rates would now average, Fed funds would now average at 430, and assuming that general repo is somewhere around there, you are getting positive carry at the long end, but 2-year notes are at 410, and they've just been told that we are not cutting again until the data tells us to. So what do 2-year notes do? Well, they don't rally very much, if at all. In fact, they're more likely to back up a few basis points just for the sake of safety and because you have no carry, while the long end should really quite like it and it's got positive carry. So the odds of some sort of a flattener are become very high. That actually is supposed to, how shall we say, support equities because the multiple would be unchanged to slightly better because everything is priced off the very long end of the curve rather than the short end. But I have the feel that for the first time in a long time, people would start preferring bonds to equities. That is my feeling. I cannot truly justify it, but maybe you have a different view.
Yeah. So I think the idea of a extremely hawkish, whether it's a cut, well, it would have to be a cut with an extreme hawkishness. A pause will actually delay this whole thing, which wouldn't be great for bonds. But a really hawkish move in December is good for bonds. There's just no way to really suggest that the Fed tightening monetary policy or slowing the easing is anything but good for the long end of the bond market. Um, and so,
Especially with real rates around 2%.
Right. And so the question becomes, what's the knee-jerk reaction? Listen, if they're really, really hawkish, bonds are going to, led by twos, are going to sell off a little bit. But that's when they're a buy. And at that point, I think you just have to look at bonds as more attractive than stocks. And so equities, what would happen in a real hawkish equity press conference? Well, I think your gut is about right. I think we sell off. Is it a 1% sell off or more? It's not going to be much more than that because, as you said, bonds are going to be okay. So to me, at that point, what do? You have bonds down, maybe down a little bit, and you buy them, but you have stocks down 1%. Do you sell them? I think you do.
Yeah. Well, the way I'm thinking about it is this. If they are truly data dependent and they do convince the market that they are through, I don't know, whatever it is they need to do to really convince us, then what happens? Then all you're looking for is weakness in the economy, aren't you? That you are hoping to get weakness in the economy so that you get cuts. Well, why would equities like that? For the first time in just about 2 years, you'd have to start preferring bonds to equities.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
So you would increase your allocation to bonds and decrease your allocation to equities for the first time in 2 years.
Realizing what we're saying is the Fed pivots.
Right. What are the odds of that happening? Who the hell knows? But we just have to be ready for that behavior. Because it's logical to me. That's the logical compromise.
Right.
It might not happen. The odds are not huge, but we have to, be ready for that. And next episode, we can talk about the more likely scenario, i.e. they just keep on cutting and they don't do anything.
Right.
But that is easy. Right. That's bullish for equities.
Right. In that case, a portfolio that has a little gold, a little bit of equities, and a good allocation of equities, and no duration, soldiers on.
Right. So there's nothing that needs to be done if they just cut and don't say very much, and they just have more or less the same dot plots, maybe one cut taken out of the terminal rate. I mean, that's easy, i.e. you do nothing. You might even need to increase your allocation to equities. The tough one is what to do if they're really, really hawkish. And I think we have our playbook for in case that happens. The odds might not be great, but we have to be ready for it.
Yep, agreed.
I think that's about it. I'll mention that and what we need to do in my segments. But until next week, I think that's about all we need to cover.
Yep, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.